welcome to this episode of Policing TV. I'm Ben Twomey, your presenter, and I'm delighted to be joined by Penelope Gibbs, the Chief Executive of Transform Justice, a charity that's campaigning for the justice system to be fairer and more compassionate. So how are you doing, Penelope?
I'm doing fine, thanks, and delighted to be here.
Great to have you with us. So we're talking about something that is very current and for lots of people, not only in government but also across the criminal justice system, is causing them very big headaches, and that is the fact that prisons, so we're told, are completely full. So the Labour government, since it came into power just earlier this year, has been very quick to talk about how the prison system is basically at breaking point. It's reached the point where it's so full that they need to actually release prisoners early back into the community. My first question, I guess it's an obvious one, but why are prisons full?
That is a long story, but the short story is that more people are being sent to prison than there are enough places for. So, we have a certain number of prison places, and basically sentencing and remand has gone up and up. So I'd give four main reasons. One, over time. So this has been a gradual process. It's not some kind of sudden thing. And primary legislation, so the laws that Parliament has passed have increased sentences and also introduced new prison sentences where they weren't before. And that's been a kind of 20-year process, really. So the prison population actually doubled under the new Labour government. It was a bit steady for a while, and then now it's increasing again. The other thing is actually what we call sentence inflation. So that is where there's been no change in the primary legislation, in the actual law, but actually the kind of level of prison sentences seem to be floating up. And that's definitely happened in a lot of cases, particularly about violent crime. And it may be linked to what are called sentencing guidelines, which are used by all criminal judges to guide their sentencing. They're not a dictation, but they are pretty well followed. I'd say also remand is a big issue. So all those who are waiting for their trial, if they've pleaded not guilty, and people who've been convicted but are waiting sentence are on remand in prisons. And that amount, we have now in prisons the highest remand population we have had since figures were actually ever gathered. And that is partly because of the court backlog. So what's happened is even pre-COVID, the kind of cases waiting to be tried in the courts was getting higher and higher. And that's through COVID, that increased a lot because the Crown Courts were closed a lot of that time. And then subsequently, I think everybody thought maybe it would start decreasing, but actually the Crown Court backlog has got worse. The Magistrates Court backlog is also pretty bad. And that means that somebody who is waiting for their trial is likely to wait longer. And if they're waiting in prison, as many are, clearly that increases the remand population. So we've got a specific problem about remand. And then I suppose lastly, I'd say that, you've got a kind of terrible situation where because the prisons are so full, they can't do anything rehabilitative for people in prison, or hardly anything. Therefore, people are more likely to come out of prison without having had those courses or whatever, and then reoffend when they leave. And then the other issue is, because of squeezes on local authorities and so on, and more prisoners, when they get out, they've got less support, like housing and so on, to actually help them move on in their lives away from crime. So we've got a kind of, a whole load of factors that are all leading to the same answer, which is too many people being sent to prison for the places available. And one more thing is that the government wanted, not that I and many others think it's a good idea to increase prison capacity by 20,000 places, but they have had problems with the planning process, which means that those new prison places and new prisons haven't been built in the timeline that they thought they would.
That's a really comprehensive overview there. One of the things you didn't say, which police officers might have been hoping they could pat themselves on the back for, is that the police have just been better at their jobs, catching more people, prosecuting effectively, and then finding that they're put into prison if they've committed crimes. Is that not something? There's not more crime. There's not more police activity that's caused this.
No, I mean, the gold standard for measuring crime is something called the Crime Survey of England and Wales, and there is, over the last kind of 5 years, there's been quite a lot of reduction actually in crime, and sort of about the last year it's sort of steadied out, but there's no genuine increase in crime out there. And there's also, I have to say, not much evidence that the police are increasing prosecution that much. They might in the future, but actually they've got an alternative which is fantastic, which is resolving crime out of court. So one would hope that in the situation we are, that they would use more cautions, community resolutions, and other rehabilitative options which are out of court. But as it is, the new police officers who've come on stream, the increased numbers might lead to more prosecutions, but to my knowledge, that is not a big driver at the moment. It might be in the future.
So this is why it's quite complicated then, because the kind of common sense approach would be that you get more crime, therefore you get more prisoners, or more people committing crime, therefore you convict more people. But that's not the case. Can I just focus on the point you made about remand? So there's people who are imprisoned at the moment. They're on remand, as you say. They've not necessarily been sentenced yet. So there are people there who are potentially innocent of the crime, or will be proven innocent in the court of the crime. What does that mean for a justice system when you've got a record number of people that are potentially in that situation?
Well, to be honest, apparently it makes prisons much more difficult to manage, because obviously people on remand are on the edge the whole time, and I mean, to me, it's grossly unfair that, we have a system where, in principle, people are innocent until proven guilty, and remand should only really be used in very small number of circumstances. I think, we've always slightly overused it on a kind of risk aversion basis, and I think that, to be honest, the police are very pro-remand because they can be quite risk averse. They'd rather somebody was detained and is definitely going to turn up to trial than any chance that they're in the community, and the risk that might pose. But the fact is, say with magistrates' courts, all those who are remanded and then tried in a magistrates' court, actually 2/3 do not go on to get an immediate custodial sentence. So that just shows that actually there is room to reduce remand, which the government could do something about. But it's really unfair. I mean, people are waiting, years in prison, and then some of them being acquitted, and you get no compensation, nothing.
Yeah, and there's a theory, isn't there, that the justice system can work if some people that have committed crimes get away with it, but it can't work if innocent people find themselves convicted or imprisoned for crimes. And obviously, without a conviction, there's lots of people in that situation.
Yeah, and also for every person waiting on remand, there's a complainant, who is also waiting for the trial, for whom that's very traumatic.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah. So you talked about being risk averse, and the police potentially not wanting people that would be dangerous or committing more crimes out in the community, very understandably. The government has taken an action that comes with some risk in releasing early prisoners. Do you think that's the right short-term solution, or were there other options available?
I mean, it was kind of the only solution, and basically the previous administration, the Conservatives were doing the same thing. They just weren't kind of letting us know they were doing it. So they released a huge number of prisoners early, technically on a slightly different basis, but it ended up being the same thing. To be honest, I don't think it makes a sod's bit of difference whether people are released after 40% of their sentence or 50%. It's in the wider scale of things, given that prisons are not rehabilitating, it won't make a difference. I think the critical problem is that people don't get enough support when they leave. So, what I think is essential, and I think there were some problems with the early release of prisoners sort of in the spring, is they need housing, they need support, they need help to get jobs and so on. Otherwise, we're just on the usual revolving door. But that revolving door would probably happen whether it was 40 or 50. And as I say, there's already been sentence inflation and an increase in sentences. So we're only going back now to, in reality, to a kind of situation in sentencing that we probably had 10 years ago.
Completely understand the argument about rehabilitation and the revolving door, and how prisons aren't working in that sense. But what do you say to defenders of prisons that say, actually, the more time, even if it's 50% compared to 40%, the more time you keep someone behind bars who would be out there committing crimes, is the more time that you keep people safe from that person? What do you say to them?
Well, I would say overall, prison is not good in the long term at making society safer. It is necessary for some people, but there was a very good report done by the College of Policing What Works Centre where they analysed the effectiveness of prison, and it was very, very clear that prison increases reoffending. So yeah, if you can buy a couple of weeks, but if prison overall increases reoffending, then we need to be quite wary about our usage of it.
Absolutely, and thinking about the types of crime that have been committed by people that are now being released early, I was reading that domestic abuse was one of the common types of category. Is that an area where you're particularly concerned because of the very common repeat offences that happen?
Yeah, I mean, domestic abuse is a very serious crime, but interestingly, I've just kind of said the wrong thing, because it's not a crime. It's a flag attached to other crimes. It's a label. So it could be criminal damage, it could be theft, it could be assault. So it's a very broad range. And what I would say is nothing is done in prison to change attitudes and behaviour of those who've committed domestic abuse flagged crimes. Nothing. So, it is, what needs to happen is, I don't think there's any kind of sense in keeping those for the other 10% of the sentence, those people who've been convicted for domestic abuse. But what I do think is essential is the support mechanisms on the outside, the communication with the victims, and so on. And critically, can we do something to change attitudes and behaviour? I mean, otherwise it's just a warehouse where the person's going to come out sometime anyway.
Yeah, completely understand. The government then, they're taking this short-term solution. You say probably the only solution that they would have to the prisons being full is to make sure that there are space available. You talked about them thinking about growing capacity, so more prison places, but you don't think that's the right answer. Are they talking to you, or are they open to ideas that actually maybe it's not all about just getting a bigger and bigger prison estate and more prisoners into it?
I mean, they're saying two potentially contradictory things at the same time. So they are keeping to the previous government's commitment to build 20,000 more prison places. which is pretty unprecedented rise. So they are still saying those are needed, but they are also setting up something called the sentencing review, and that was in the manifesto, and that has the promise that it will review sentencing altogether. And obviously, people like myself who are not convinced that prison contributes very well to reducing crime would say, let's think again about what we use prison for and reduce our level of imprisonment. And the interesting thing is we're an outlier now in the Western world. So our per capita use of prison is the highest in Western Europe. The US is higher, but the US is going in a different direction. So in America, both the federal and the state prison populations have been going down for at least 5 years. So even though they were very high, they decided to reduce their prison population. And there's some amazing reductions in that. So we are the only country in the Western world where we're committed to increasing our prison population. And, it just doesn't make sense because prison doesn't work. And there's other things that can be done to prevent people offending or reoffending, which work way better.
And if prison doesn't work, you've got lots of evidence to say that it's not working and what it's trying to do. Is there a place for prisons? And if so, how big should the prison population be? We've got, I think it's close to 100,000 people in prison at the moment in England and Wales.
It's quite a bit less than that. I think they're aiming for 100,000. Yeah.
They're aiming for that's the increase that they're going to produce. So we're looking for a situation, or the government's looking for a situation where you could have up to 100,000 people in prison. What sort of numbers do you think are appropriate, if you would have prisons at all?
I would have prisons. I think we need somewhere that reflects society's need to punish some people. But personally, I would reserve imprisonment for people who'd done serious violent or sexual offences. And then we've got also a secure forensic estate for people who maybe haven't done something that serious, but who've been assessed as incredibly kind of risky in terms of public protection. I would go with James Timpson. So James Timpson gave an interview, I think it was about a year and a half ago. So that's the current prisons minister. And he said that he thought 2/3 of people who are currently in prison didn't need to be there. And he said 1/3 could be released pretty swiftly, even now, and 1/3 needed more support in the community, but they could still be released without threatening public protection. So I vote with James Timpson.
And just thinking about the public perception of this, as you say, the need for a sense of punishment as part of the sense of justice. I wonder what your thoughts are on the way that politicians may shy away from this debate, because if you put a referendum to the public about the death penalty, you'd have a strong chance that you'd be reintroducing the death penalty. So getting tougher on crime plays better with the public often than the idea of some of these more nuanced arguments about rehabilitation and about making safer communities rather than just putting people in prison. So do you sympathise with politicians that they have that argument? And if you were in their shoes, would you be sticking your head above the parapet on this?
I am totally and utterly sympathetic with politicians in their quandary about this issue. But I think there is a way of talking about it which would work, which was to talk in terms of fewer victims and what is effective in terms of reducing crime and creating fewer victims. And I think that all the evidence is that, rehabilitation, support for people in the community, in terms of housing, employment, criminal records, which is one of the subjects that we campaign about, reforming that and really giving people support to move on in their lives when they've committed crime is going to be more effective in terms of creating fewer victims. So that's the language I would always use. And I think that that's, in the end, what both victims and people in general want. They want less crime, and they want the people who did it to have, some reason not to do it again. And they think that prison is going to be that reason, but I'm afraid the evidence is that it isn't effective. And so I think the challenge for politicians is to persuade the public and let them know what is actually effective in terms of creating fewer victims in the future.
Thank you so much, Penelope. I think that's a good point to end on here. A really fascinating insight into a very live issue right now. And I'd be really interested in hearing what our audience has to say about this. If you want to get involved in the comments or on social media, then please do let us know what you think. Does more prison places mean less crime? Does it mean fewer victims, as Penelope has said? And can the government get a grip of this in a way that they can explain to the public and take the public on a journey to some longer term solutions that aren't just the immediate building of prison places or releasing of prisoners early? But thank you so much again, Penelope. Really appreciate your time, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.